Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Calabrese. I'm a scholar at the Middle East Institute, and I have the privilege and the pleasure of directing the Middle East Institute's project on Middle East-Asia relations, the acronym of which is MAP. I commend to you a slew of publications that we've managed to gather on a variety of topics related to cross-regional relations since the project was launched just a few months ago, and we have many more publications and events to come. But the reason why you're here is to have the opportunity to engage a speaker who really needs no introduction in Washington, D.C., and probably many viewers, wherever they may be, in the Middle East, North America, in Asia, are also well-versed in the writings and the reputation of our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson. Dr. Michael Hudson, as you well know, taught for many years and directed the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Over the last couple of years, he's been a professor and also the director of Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. So this is an opportunity for a collaborative endeavor today, whereby Middle East Institute West, that's where we are, engages with Middle East Institute East to get the unique perspective of Dr. Hudson on how the Arab world, turmoil and changes in the Middle East look from his perch in Singapore. I'd like to welcome him and to welcome you, and if at the conclusion of Dr. Hudson's remarks you would wait for a microphone to be passed to you before you pose what I'm sure will be very thought-provoking questions, and then give your name and your affiliation, I'd appreciate that. Thanks a lot for coming today. Dr. Hudson, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's really nice to be back. I have come, it's about 14 hours from Singapore to London, and then another 7 to 8 hours to Washington. So it's a long haul, but it's always fun to be coming back this direction. I've been in Singapore. The National University of Singapore invited me to come out to help develop a Middle East Institute that they had established a few years ago. So for the last 2.5 years, I've been trying to do that. And we have, I think, I'll show you the propaganda that we put out that I think Mimi Kirk, who was doing a wonderful job with us in Singapore, developing our publications and websites, has now been lured back to Washington, and here she is in the other Middle East Institute. But I couldn't resist the opportunity, since I'm coming over here for a brief visit. I'll be speaking at a conference down at William & Mary later this week, to come by and see if we could actually establish a link between the mother of all Middle East institutes, which is this one, and the Eastern upstart that is just really getting underway. But it is a challenge and a most exciting opportunity I've found out in Singapore to try and develop a more scholarly interest in the Middle East. And they have given us substantial resources so that we now have a research staff of approximately 15. We've engaged, we've recruited from all around the world, postdoctoral fellows, senior fellows, across a multidisciplinary spectrum. We have 3 broad research clusters: politics and security, economics and business, culture, history and society. And we're trying to engage as best we can most of the geographic parts of the larger Middle East. Can't do it all, but we do have people that are from or specialize in North Africa, Egypt, certainly Bilad al-Sham, the Levant, Iraq, and Iran. And we're working hard to develop a particular interest in the Gulf. the Gulf is very interesting to the people of Singapore because mainly for economic reasons, but also for strategic reasons. So, oh, sorry. I'll just leave that there. But what I'd like to do is just share with you some impressions that I've had from Singapore about how they're looking at the Middle East, how they're looking at the so-called pivot, the rebalancing that is being undertaken by the Obama administration. Now, as far as I can tell, most Americans think of Singapore as the place where chewing gum is forbidden, and the cane is frequently used to punish the very few wrongdoers that are to be found in that country. But actually, that's quite, I think, quite misleading and somewhat out of date. Singapore is a prosperous, vibrant Asian powerhouse that punches far above its weight. A growing financial, transportation, communications, oil refining, cultural and political center, and by virtue of its geographical location, adjacent to the Strait of Malacca and the Indian Ocean, it likes to see itself, and it would like others to see it as a kind of a hub between Asia proper, including East Asia and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So it's the ideal place, really, from which to observe and to survey these kind of, what we see as these tectonic geopolitical shifts that are bringing these regions closer together. Now, in Singapore these days, the chattering classes are talking about the rise of Asia, by which they mean mainly China, but also India, and the decline of America. And it is a theme that elicits both pride and apprehension. Southeast Asia's prosperity depends on the Chinese economic powerhouse, but Chinese assertiveness in the East and South China Seas lately is a worry. And while the idea of American decline is often met, I must say, with smiles of satisfaction, there is also concern that Washington's famous pivot toward Asia will either be too feeble or too provocative to a region that wants good relations with both of these giants, the dominant superpower, the United States, and the emerging superpower, China. Now, another topic of growing interest I found, and that's probably why I was invited to go to Singapore, is, in fact, the Middle East. They've come to this, I think, rather recently. But the fact that the Singapore government would make a substantial investment in creating a Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore is one indication of this interest. And in my lecture to Singaporean students on where is the Middle East, I like to quote Alfred Thayer Mahan, everybody's quoting him, I think, these days, who once defined it as from Suez to Singapore. Students are not quite ready to be convinced that Singapore is actually part of the Middle East, but the connections, perhaps were there and maybe are there. In a conference in Kolkata in 2011 devoted to defining the boundaries of a region which the Indians like to refer to as West Asia, I recalled how the U.S. State Department had created a Bureau of Near East and South Asia that stretched, as one diplomat I remember said, from Marrakesh to Bangladesh. Singapore and Oman have recently established or reestablished a cultural connection symbolized by the voyage of a reconstructed Omani dhow from Muscat to Singapore. And Singapore's small but influential ethnic Arab community actively celebrates its mostly Yemeni, Hadrami actually, connections. And as the anthropologist Eng Seng Ho has observed, recently we had him and some other scholars in Singapore at our institute recently, he was observing that there are Islamic commercial and historical threads, as he put it, linking Southeast Asia and the Middle East. So there is considerable interest, and of course there are statistics which I will not trouble you with, citing the substantial growth of trade and investment between these areas. So, having tried to establish that Singapore is suddenly looking westward, I'd like to turn to the question whether the relationship and these tectonic shifts that seem to indicate the decline of America and the rise of Asia and China how valid are they really? And I think the main point that I'd like to throw out here is that if the U.S. is losing its traditional dominance of the Middle East, that is not really because of the rise of Asia or the rise of China. That's probably due to it's probably self-inflicted. I think the failure of many American policies throughout the region has led to a substantial diminution of influence or credibility, or what some people call soft power, in this region, even though the hard power structures presumably will remain. So even though there's much talk, and we hear a lot of this in Singapore, of the rise of Asia, I don't think the shift is really, if there is a decline of American influence in the Middle East, it's not really due yet to the Chinese or the Indians and others pushing in. They're far from being able or even willing to challenge the sort of dominant U.S. position. But our traditional allies in Asia worry about the relative global weakening of the U.S. vis-a-vis China, and so there's considerable ambivalence as to the workability of the rebalancing or the pivot. And my impression is that in Singapore, the U.S. pivot or the rebalancing to Asia is regarded with mixed feelings. There is relief that the U.S. is reacting to China's forward policies in the East and South China Seas, and there's a lot of concern, of course, among the smaller peripheral states that China is flexing its muscles in an unacceptable and threatening manner. But there is also, among many, skepticism that the U.S. pivot will actually have enough muscle to contain China. And in fact, the very idea of trying to contain China through a chain of military alliances or a military presence in the manner that the United States sought to contain the Soviet Union is I think, debated seriously in Asia, whether this is actually doable or not. So I was attending a conference at the National University of Singapore not long ago devoted to the rise of the Indian military in the Indian Ocean. And one of the participants remarked very dismissively that the deployment of perhaps 125 U.S. Marines to Darwin in Australia, far from being a sign of American power being projected, was actually a bit ridiculous. That this was not really enough, and if this is the kind of containment that the Americans envisage, how can we really take it seriously? Because the United States just won't be able to mobilize sufficient resources in the long run, to contain a China that is becoming more and more assertive. And in these peripheral places, for example, in the countries of ASEAN, the Southeast Asian regional organization, in most of them, there is concern over how to keep good relations with China and the United States at the same time. And coming from a little place, what the Singaporeans like to call their little red dot at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, they say, well, we depend on China for so much, and China is everywhere, Chinese are everywhere, mainland Chinese are coming in to fuel the Singapore economy and so on. We don't want to get on the wrong side of China. But at the same time, we are very concerned that this emerging giant, which has already emerged in so many economic kinds of ways, will be emerging in strategic and military ways as well. Therefore, we are happy, guardedly happy, I should say, that the United States will redeploy or deploy some additional naval power as it is doing in Singapore. But the question is how to keep the balance. There's also a worry from the perspective of Asia about what is actually going on in the Middle East. There's a concern that whether it's the Arab Spring or other kinds of issues, in particular the very serious tensions between Iran and the United States, Israel, and the Gulf, will, if things really break out, which they could, that this would affect Asian oil and gas supplies. So if the U.S. is less able to stabilize the Middle East, which seems to be the case, that's a problem, and the Asians worry about that. So if on the one hand, on one level, many Asian commentators are saying, well, we are perfectly okay to see America decline. On the other hand, if that decline means an acceleration of conflict in this important region, the Middle East, we are concerned about that. What would a war in the Gulf do to both the supply of energy and the price of energy in a region that, of course, is accounting for most of the demand for oil and gas today? So, let me turn to the question of the Middle East itself, and what I would argue is an increasing problem for the United States in the region. I think there's no doubt, and it seems really redundant, unnecessary to tell this audience that the Middle East will continue to be important to the U.S. And I noticed that Tom Donilon, in a speech not long ago to the Asia Society, made it very clear that the pivot will not mean a reduction of U.S. assets, military assets, in other parts of the world, surely including the Middle East. So the Middle East it will continue to be central, I think, in American strategic thinking. First of all, obviously because of Israel. And because the commitment to Israel, as we have lately seen demonstrated yet again in President Obama's visit not long ago, the commitment to Israel, which is driven, I think, mostly by domestic pressures, will continue. And I think the Americans will also be reassessing the contested notion of Israel as a strategic asset. That was always, I think, a much exaggerated proposition in the days of the Soviet Union. How could Israel be a strategic asset to prevent Soviet expansion and influence in the Middle East, when in some ways it was giving the Soviets an opportunity to gain influence they might otherwise not have had. But today, with the Middle East, as we all know, increasingly in turmoil, as a result of the Arab uprisings that have happened, that are still in process, and that probably will continue to happen in other places, American thinkers may be supposing, well, Israel, even though it causes us a lot of problems in the region, is still an asset that may become more important in a region that becomes more chaotic. So there's that. And then, of course, there is the oil factor. Back in the days of the Cold War, we used to say, I remember in seminars on Middle East international relations at Georgetown, we used to talk about the Holy Trinity of Georgetown being a good Catholic Jesuit school. It's a little bit irreverent, I suppose, to say this, but we used to speak of the Holy Trinity of American interests in the Middle East, which of course were Israel, oil, and containment of the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union is no more, but the oil is still there, and the oil and energy are still important. And even though oil and energy may be becoming less directly important to the United States as new sources and new technologies reduce dependence on the Middle East, that does not really seem to be the case for Asia. And for the major industrial economies of Asia, China above all, the question of access to Middle Eastern oil and gas is extremely important. And because Asia is extremely important to the United States, there is therefore a continuing, and there should be a continuing concern in Washington to not exactly to secure Middle Eastern oil. How can you do that? Why do you need to do that? But somehow to be there to prevent really serious disruptions in supply. So the oil factor, in a sense, is mediated for us through Asia. Since as Asia becomes important, Asia needs oil. The United States, which still dominates the oil-producing regions of the Middle East, still has a function to perform. And I recall a very interesting piece I saw by John Alterman, which suggested that in the future, the Americans will be, in a sense, viewing or accessing even the Middle East through Asia rather than through Europe. So I think one would argue, one has to, it's pretty obvious to argue that the Middle East will continue to be important to the United States. But then that raises the question, if that's the case, what do we do, or what can we do, if anything, about U.S. influence and capabilities in the Middle East decreasing? Now again, I'm a bit of a skeptic on saying that the rise of Asia is a sort of a cause of the U.S. decline in the Middle East or elsewhere, and I think we can take at face value the assertions of American officials that there will be no. This is not kind of a zero-sum game. That there will be no shuttling away of American assets from the Middle East just because we want to pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia doesn't mean a decline directly in the U.S. military presence there. Nevertheless, even as the U.S. military, presumably, even if you lose an aircraft carrier in the Gulf, which I guess we will, I don't know that it makes that much difference, even though the military capability will remain, I think the more serious issue is this loss of influence and credibility and leverage. And here, I think, when we look at recent history, repercussions of the misadventure in Iraq, the indecisive course of the war in Afghanistan have led to many thinking that the American giant, even when it deploys its enormous military resources, is not such a strong giant if the deployment of those military resources doesn't lead to a clear victory. And it certainly didn't lead to a clear victory in Iraq, and probably not in Afghanistan either. So when we look at the repercussions of Iraq 10 years later, we just jointly organized a conference, incidentally, in Melbourne at Deakin University on Iraq 10 years on, and our Australian colleagues, even though Australia was fully invested in George W. Bush's project, were extremely critical of the way things had gone, and very critical of the Australians, like the Brits, basically not objecting to the American call to join in. So, with the not so successful applications of force recently, we also see impotence and, of course, imbalance on the question of Palestine and Israel. And here, the president, who raised a lot of hopes in the Middle East with his speech at Cairo University in 2009, almost immediately backtracked, and in his latest visit to convince the Israeli government and the Israeli population of undying and enduring American support, he was quoted as saying, well, you know, this is a really hard job, and kind of shrugging his shoulders. So what does that tell people? Well, if the world's only remaining superpower is continually paralyzed in dealing with an issue that has probably generated more anti-Western, anti-American sentiment in the Middle East over the years than any other, that's not so good. And then lately there's the question of drones. The question of drones in particular, but more broadly, the question of how do you conduct what used to be called the war on terror. And I think here the very broad spectrum of Arab and Muslim opinion sees arrogance, heavy-handedness, and what the United States calls collateral damage from the application of these technologies as being really unacceptable. So we have, I think, ultimately, regretfully, a failure to engage or win over Muslim public opinion. And then there's the question of the Arab Spring. Now, who can say what the right answer to dealing with the Arab Spring is? The Arab uprisings have exploded, and I believe that they are part of a continuing historical process of popular protest against the existing authoritarian structures of the region. But what does one do about it if one is the world's hegemon? And here, my sense is that the impression is one of indecisiveness and inconsistency on the Arab uprisings. You support some, you don't support others. It's not quite clear whether principles and the support for popular uprisings against non-democratic regimes should be the dominant theme, or indeed whether, in fact, it would be better, it is better to support regimes, even though they may be dictatorial and unpleasant, but at least they are in some ways reliable and predictable and friendly. So there is that. And it's ironical, I think, in a way, that the the core group of countries in the region that the United States regards as, real friends, allies, clients. I'm thinking of the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's pretty evident that the leadership in Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf states is disturbed about the Americans going wobbly. Because from their point of view, the uprisings have been an unexpected and unwelcome development, and one that they seem to feel ultimately threatens their legitimacy and stability. And they wonder why the United States seems to have, in some ways, welcomed popular uprisings and so forth, or at least acquiesced in them, instead of standing up for traditional allies. Bahrain is, of course, currently a case in point where all of these issues are being kind of tested out. And if the leaders of the GCC would like the United States to buy into the contention, their contention that what is happening in Bahrain is an Iranian-inspired sectarian revolt, a rebellion that needs to be put down. But the United States, of course, is conflicted. The Fifth Fleet is based at Bahrain. Is it important that that base remain? Is the fact that the base is there the reason that the United States has, in a sense, only verbally criticized the Bahrain leadership for its very tough position on the protests that have happened there? So it is a little bit sort of being caught in the middle. You don't really identify yourself with forces of democracy and change, but you also don't fully identify yourselves with the incumbent establishment that is very much alarmed by what is happening. So my argument fundamentally then is that if there is an American decline in the Middle East, it is largely self-inflicted. And it's not really that Asia is pushing us out. Asia is just standing there looking. And let me turn now, if I may, if time is still on my side here, back to the China factor. We've had several meetings with Chinese Middle East scholars in Beijing, and we've invited some of them to Singapore, and it's a very interesting conversation that we have had. And there clearly is in China and also in Singapore at our East Asian Institute, which focuses very heavily on China, a big debate as to how China will exercise its growing global influence. And these analysts will note that modern China has not really had to formulate a global strategy. It's only fairly recently that China suddenly is astride the global commons in a way that really was not the case before, which means that they're kind of feeling their way along. That's the impression that China watchers get looking at the debates in China about what to do elsewhere in the world. There's a debate in China now over what direction to prioritize for this vast country. There are those that argue that continuing to prioritize a southern and eastern strategy, that is, pushing forward, asserting Chinese prominence in the East China Sea with the Japan Islands, in the South China Sea, with challenges that implicate the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, whether that is the preferred strategy, that's where they should kind of put their energies, or whether there should be what some Chinese analysts are calling a march west, looking to the west, developing a Western strategy, going back to the famous Silk Road, both in its terrestrial and maritime dimensions. Should China be pushing in those directions? So there are those that say it's not enough simply to deal with China's traditional security problems, which are to the east and south. Concerns from Taiwan, worries about perceived American containment, and so forth, that they really need to look in these other directions as well, especially to the west and to the north. And that means, in a sense, rebalancing, a Chinese rebalancing, the rebalancing of strategic priorities. Marching west would mean reactivating and dominating the old Silk Route, partnering with Russia to contain and maybe roll back U.S. influence, positioning itself to secure Middle East energy supplies and supply routes, and containing India's growing aspirations in the Indian Ocean and farther east. It's interesting that India considers Singapore a kind of far outpost for India's geopolitical strategy. Eventually, not immediately, but eventually China and the US will face each other in the Middle East in a kind of geopolitical arena. And while so far there are no obvious conflicts of interest, there probably will be as gradually China develops a blue water navy and global geostrategic clout. But right now, for the moment and for the foreseeable future, China is a free rider on Middle East matters, leaving the United States to do the heavy lifting, as in Palestine, the Arab uprisings and so forth. But it is already showing that it can play a blocking role, a blocking diplomatic role, and that, of course, has been seen in the case of Syria and Iran. So, in conclusion, let me paraphrase some remarks that the permanent secretary of the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Bilahari Kausikan, made to a conference in Israel not long ago. And among other things, he said that he doubted that there would be any strategically significant diversion of U.S. policy attention and assets away from the Middle East, thus reassuring the Israelis and America's Arab allies. And on the evolving U.S.-China relationship, this Singaporean diplomat asserted that while China indeed is rising, that he didn't think the U.S. really was declining, and that the U.S. will still remain the only truly global power for some time to come. The Sino-U.S. relation is becoming the most important bilateral relationship for the entire world. And he argued that it does not have to be adversarial, although there will be tensions. It would be futile, he argued, for the U.S. to try and contain China the way it contained the USSR, and cooler heads in China would not want to see a Cold War develop, even as China incrementally increases its influence in East Asia. So as for the Middle East, as China grows militarily and its thirst for energy, especially from the Middle East, continues to increase, it will inevitably become more entangled in the region's issues and will have to consider whether it can coordinate with the U.S. there or whether the relationship will be more confrontational. Well, I know some American analysts who think, let them get into the Middle East. Let them get stuck in the swamp of the Middle East. That is the best thing that could happen to divert China and cool whatever aggressive ambitions it might have in other places. But I think the missing piece in this evolving strategic puzzle is the Middle East itself. We're always speaking about outsiders acting upon it. But what about if the region itself were to develop some more coherent sense of agency and be able to play a more active role? We don't know. But I think as the Arab uprisings continue, and if gradually over time we're seeing governments develop that are more responsible, more responsive to public opinion, then it's important to take account of what that public opinion is. In general, as I've said earlier, it's not necessarily all that favorable to the United States for reasons that we have discussed. So both the US and China and other major external players like Russia and India are facing a region that, if I'm right about this, that it is starting to exert its own sense of purpose and agency despite the current chaos and confusion. So how will Asia, how will China and India, the big powers of Asia, as they become more and more involved with this region, how will they deal with Palestine and Israel? How will they deal with the Arab uprisings? How will they deal with the Islamic factor? And on that point, is Islam, and remember China has a huge Muslim population, but not necessarily a happy one, how will Islam be a kind of a strategic asset or liability for China in the region? In some ways it's similar to the double-edged aspect that the US faces in dealing with political Islam. So I would say, and in that respect, just to give you an example, I have attended conferences in China and in Singapore, and I have seen transcripts of conferences in India where one of our friends and colleagues from the United Arab Emirates, Dr. Abdul Khalik Abdullah, has really taken these guys to task, and much to their surprise. And I've heard him lecture Chinese Middle East specialists saying, you know, we're so disappointed in you. How come you're not on our side? Why are you sort of playing it in the middle? And very similarly, he has said the same thing to Indian audiences. He said, we expected more of you. We thought India was part of what we used to call the third world, and you had a kind of a third world sensibility, but you don't seem to. I mean, that's perhaps a small example of the Middle East region itself beginning to assert itself and to stop, to refuse to be simply a passive place that is acted upon. So I would say, finally, don't underestimate the eventual ability of the regional players to enhance or inhibit the strategic ambitions of these emerging powers. And I'll stop here. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hudson. I'm not going to take any time of my own to ask questions, because I know that you must have a whole lot of them, given the landscape, or the several landscapes that Dr. Hudson has painted for us in his remarks. So if you wouldn't mind, just raise your hand. One of our interns will provide you with a mic, or I can provide you with this one, so you'll be our first questioner. And please identify yourself by name and affiliation.
Yes, hi, I'm Tom Sullivan. I guess my affiliation, you could say ASI, although I came on my own. So, but I just have a question. So over the last month and sort of recently, Kuwait in particular has introduced a bunch of measures that appear to be intended to make the country a less attractive place for expatriate workers, many of whom come from Asia. And what I'm wondering is should this be read in the context of domestic politics in terms of increasing job opportunities for nationals? Also, what about if them or other Gulf states take measures like that, what would the impact on relations with Asia be? Because I know that it is a significant source of job opportunities for people from that region.
Well, that's a very important question, and one dimension of this whole complicated relationship that I didn't deal with at all was the sort of the sociological and cultural dimension. And and this is a very interesting, and I think for Asians, a rather problematical matter. The Middle East imports huge amounts of Asian low-end domestic construction labor and they don't pay them very much. They don't treat them very well. That's caused lots of friction. Just ask the Philippines about that. So it works in a sense in both ways. Asian countries are unhappy to see their people who are drawn to the Middle East for economic employment reasons mistreated. And on the other side, people there look at these Asians in I won't say necessarily a racist way, but there's kind of cultural there are cultural differences, and so you would imagine down the road if would China or India be able to engage in what we sometimes call people-to-people diplomacy, or to have a presence beyond the strictly economic and political, if in fact there are these mutual hostilities or negative feelings toward people of other races. I was talking recently with my trusted research assistant, Rana Khoury, who was here, who was traveling recently in North Africa with a Singaporean friend, and was quite troubled by the way that Tunisians were looking at the Chinese Singaporean as a kind of an exotic object that needs to be photographed. So without going further, I think you raise a very interesting point that there are sort of social tensions that would surely complicate the emerging Asian Middle Eastern connections.
My name is Dick Rose, and I'm with the Council for a Community of Democracies. Your point about stability based upon regimes that are more dictatorial than democratic, and the fact that the uprising in the Middle East has caused that stability to be removed by having undetermined rule by democratic means emerging in its place. Couldn't one argue that the stability that places like Bahrain, for instance, would have to look forward to if they recognize how weak the monarchy is, would be more of a democratic rule based there rather than the very fragile kind of rule they have under a monarchy? Or put in the larger term, that the Arab uprising really is saying that the future of stability in the Middle East is based upon the popular rising, the popular rule, the popular voices that you said had to be listened to more than before. And so if you argue that way, some of the Arabs would begin to look at Mubarak and some of the others who've lost their footing as threatening them unless they take steps to establish a new stability based upon more democratic rule than they had before. And in their self-interest, can't you argue that that is something they should look to and do something about?
Well, my impression is that the elites that rule the Gulf countries are pretty much convinced that these uprisings that have happened elsewhere are bad news, and that that movement, that tendency, needs to be contained. And I think initially, if you remember the first months of enthusiasm in 2011, as these uprisings occurred with such remarkable rapidity, there was a strong feeling, I think a strong feeling here, that this is, it's high time that something like this happened, and that ultimately governments that enjoy popular support, popular legitimacy, in which there is meaningful political participation, that this would be good, and the region, in a sense, would become more normal. But as the uprising process goes on, of course, it takes different forms, and there's a great deal of confusion. There are many negative effects, economic slowdowns, and so on and so on, and a loss of sort of authority in many of these places. You're seeing assassinations here and there. You're seeing parts of a country like Libya that are essentially out of control of a new government, and so on. And that, I think, leads many people, certainly the more conservative ones, to say, well, that only goes to show that this is really bad. This is a bad thing that has happened, and we long for the good old days when there would be a strong man to keep things under control. Well, I don't subscribe to that. I think that ultimately the movements, these popular movements, will sort themselves out. But there's no doubt that as we look at the situation in Egypt, for example, it's a very messy business. Nobody knows for sure whether a broad-based, orderly rule of law, political practices will emerge, or whether, in fact, new forces that came to have positions of power because of the uprisings will themselves become dictatorial and authoritarian. So there's a lot of ambivalence about that. But it seems to me that in a way the genie is out of the bottle, and people are now feeling that they ought to have much more of a voice in affairs than has traditionally been the case. And for outside powers, as I indicated, it's a very confusing situation. The United States reacts this way and that way, and I don't think there's actually a clear policy as to how to confront these things.
Hi, John Alterman, CCAS. Welcome back. Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. I want to talk a little bit at the end. You mentioned Islam. And of course, the Singaporeans were very interested in terrorism before they were interested in the Middle East. They put a lot of money into understanding terrorism.
It's true.
My understanding is that they are very concerned with the rise of Middle Eastern expired Islamic terrorism and its impact on Singapore. And they, to my understanding, are very concerned about the rise of Islamist political parties in the region, because they presume, as it looks from here, that those are somehow linked to a rise of extremism or rise of terrorism. That's how it looks from Washington. How does it look from Singapore? How does it look from Asia, as people look at both political Islam and an enduring concern with terrorism coming out of Islamic contexts?
Well, I think you very accurately characterize the orientation and the mindset of the Singaporean political elite. There is indeed a very strong investment in counterterrorism studies and so forth. We don't actually do that so much at the Middle East Institute at NUS, but at RSIS, the major international affairs think tank at the National Nanyang Technological University, there's a very large counterterrorism program. And I do believe that one of the reasons that Singapore did invest in establishing a Middle East Institute was out of, in fact, concern about political Islam. We had a lecture just last week by someone who I think is well known here, Ali Soufan, talking about terrorism, and he was invited by the Singapore government and had many meetings with Singaporean officials so that he could share what his experiences dealing with terrorists. So I think on one level, on the elite level in Singapore, and probably to a lesser extent in other places, because it depends on which country you're talking about, that is an accurate description. The extent to which there is a real danger, a real threat, the extent to which that there are demonstrated terrorist attacks or indications of networking, say, between Islamist extremist groups in the Middle East with those in Indonesia is, I think debatable. My own sense is that it's exaggerated, but it's there. However, I think remember that many of these places have Muslim populations of their own, and I think it's fair to say that the Malay Muslim population of Singapore, which is now it's the second ethnic group, but a very relatively small one, about 15%, feels a sense of discrimination, that they sense that their government looks upon them with suspicion, and they look at efforts by the government to, in a sense, organize the Muslim community to teach Singaporean Muslims not to be terrorists, so forth, as intrusive and demeaning in some way. And of course, in the big neighbors, which are, overwhelmingly Muslim countries, I think when you look beneath the level of the political elite, there would be differences of opinion. Malaysia is very much closer and very hospitable to Muslims from the Middle East, especially Iran and the Arab countries. And so I think you would find a somewhat different understanding there than you would among the security types.
Excuse me, would you pass the microphone? Oh, gentlemen. I'm sorry.
In passing, Jim Platt, Cambridge Energy Research.
Nice to see you again.
Mike.
Yeah.
Welcome back. You referred briefly to the China-Iran connection and China's resistance, if not obstruction, with U.S. and Western efforts to contain or obstruct or avoid Iran becoming a nuclear power. What does China have a policy toward Iran, or is it just opportunistic?
I would perhaps call it more opportunistic than sort of calculated, but my understanding is that while going along with sanctions to a certain level, nominally at least, if further sanctions were to insist that China stop buying Iranian oil, they would say, sorry, we're gonna do it anyway. And I don't know whether that might be opportunistic or maybe just sort of trying to play both sides. I think it is very interesting to see to what extent China wants to take sides in the big and dangerous conflict between Iran and the U.S. and Israel and the Gulf. My impression is that they have been prepared to, as they say, lead from behind or take a back seat, whereas the Russians, I think, have been rather more forward on this. And that, I don't know whether that's opportunism or just good sense. My impression, for whatever it's worth, is that the Chinese are still trying to figure out the Middle East. And neither they nor, I think, the other major Asian powers have got a lot of ground knowledge about it. And in some ways, they've got a long way to go. And in that sense, I suppose historically the United States has a big advantage because the United States was involved for a long time and in so many ways, quite apart from military and political matters in the Middle East. Whereas, again, that gets back to the point that this gentleman raised earlier about the cultural, the sort of the cultural divide, the psychological divide that seems to be there.
Well,
Yes.
I'm Helen Raffel. I worked 5 years in China, including in Xinjiang, in the Muslim part of China. I'm very well aware of the antagonism and suspicion between the Han Chinese and the Muslim Chinese. And I want to ask you about the Chinese in Singapore, who are predominantly Han, I'm sure. I worked in Indonesia for 2 years, and periodically, of course, the Indonesians massacre the overseas Chinese in Indonesia. You mentioned a colleague, you said Ho, I presume He.
He's actually Malaysian,
Yes,
yeah. Chinese Malaysian.
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether the Han Chinese population of Singapore itself are proud of China or worried about terrorism that makes them prefer American backing and so forth. What are their attitudes towards, and then what are the non-Chinese ethnic Singaporeans' attitudes towards the Chinese? Do they consider them a fifth column?
Well, that's really quite a fascinating topic. Singapore, as you know, is about 3/4 ethnic Chinese. And the short answer to your question is yes, I think they're very proud of China's emergence as a global powerhouse. They are also, however, being Singaporean and being concerned about their own territorial integrity and security and so forth, worried that an aggressive China could be a problem. There's also, interestingly, and again, this refers back to the cultural dimension, palpable hostility among many Singaporean Chinese toward the large number of mainland Chinese that come to Singapore to work. My understanding of this is that Singaporean Chinese look down on these people as sort of country bumpkins who chew gum, who don't have good manners, are very pushy, and when they get out of line, they really get smacked down. And some of the Chinese actually do get out of line. There have been some famous incidents where the Singaporeans really, crack down hard on them. But it's a little bit ambivalent. I think the Chinese of Singapore, who originally essentially came from southern China, are quite pleased to see China and Asia rising. The position of, as I indicated earlier, the position of the other ethnic group, the Malay Muslims, is rather more complicated, and I think they feel a certain kind of cultural isolation and resentment. They feel that being a minority in Singapore and being in some senses, not officially of course, but in some senses discriminated against, is galling, because in the larger Nusantara areas, they call it the Malay Muslim cultural zone, which embraces Indonesia and Malaysia, of course, they're the huge majority. So it's a little bit complicated, I think, in that sense.
One last question for Dr. Anthony. We can't.
No. John Duke Anthony, National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. Hello, Michael. You made allusion 2 or 3 times to the Yemenis, the Hadramis more specifically. What can you say about the ongoing legacy of that community? It had the fabled ownership of the Raffles Hotel from the Alatas family and others for a long time. Are they just a wistful memory of those heady days of the 19th century, or do they play a role of any significance worthy of mention?
I'm not quite sure how numerous the Singaporean Hadramis are. I don't know, 20,000 maybe. It's very, very small. But they are very prominent, and if you go to Arab Street, to Arab Street in Singapore, you will find them. Although they're in many other places as well. I don't have the impression that they are at the very top of the elite, but they're very well respected. They're business people mostly. They're active culturally. They have sponsored museum exhibits, illustrating the historic connections between the Hadramaut and Southeast Asia. So I would say that they do definitely count for something. And I know at least one minister comes from that community, Zainuddin Labadin. He apologizes for his name. Zain al-Abidin is his name, but he's a Singaporean of Hadrami origin, and he's been a minister of state for foreign affairs, and is now the non-resident ambassador to Kuwait. So they're small, respected, and I should add also that one of their number from the Talib family, who still has Yemeni citizenship, is actually a minister in the Yemeni government at the moment. He's Minister of Industry and Trade. Thankless job, but he's there. So I think they're small but well respected.
Folks, please put your hands together.
Okay.
To thank Dr. Hudson. And thank you for your questions, for your attendance. And please keep your eyes glued to the Middle East Asia Project website, both for our activities and for future collaborative activities between our two institutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.